Hello, everyone. Hey, thank you for joining us in the 10-minute Bible lesson. We appreciate you joining us today. If you've been following us, you know lately we've been looking at the parables of Jesus, and we've got another parable today. In fact, this parable is known as the parable of the tares. Have you ever heard of tares? Have you ever heard of this parable? Well, this parable is found in Matthew chapter 13. In fact, there are several parables in that chapter. But we're going to be looking in Matthew 13 today, and let's go ahead and begin by reading verses 24 and 25. Now, let me give you a heads up that there's a lot of verses in this parable, and we're not going to be able to cover all of them, so we're just going to kind of hit the highlights. But let's start off with verses 24 and 25. So Jesus said this, "Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way." Well, that's a kind of a dirty thing to do, I would say, wouldn't you? Yeah, I mean, now let's just start off and say if we can remember that these parables are to remind us about what the kingdom is like, the kingdom of heaven is like in some way. So Jesus is using agriculture, which would be something that the people that were listening would understand in a good way. But he's using that to describe this. So the kingdom of heaven is like a field that was sown with good seed. And so the ideal behind that would be that there would be a crop that would come up from that good seed. And obviously after the crop came up and from the good seed, then you would harvest that crop. So Jesus in this parable, he tells us that also that there was an enemy who came after this man had sown his field and sowed tares in it. And that's what I just thought was a dirty thing to do. But when you find out who the enemy is, you'll know that that's exactly what he does. He's a dirty guy. Who is the enemy? Well, let me just first say that the man who sowed the good seed is Jesus. And how do I know that? Because Jesus tells us later in this chapter about and explains the different aspects of this parable. So we know that the man represented Jesus. He's the one that sowed the good seed. And I know you already know who the person, the enemy was who sowed the tares. That would be the devil himself. Now, this is kind of interesting because tares, according to some of the commentaries that I've read, they mimicked the good grain. That is to say, it looked like good grain, but it was toxic. So I've heard people say this about this weed that's called cheat, that it mimics wheat, but it's actually not wheat. So we know that in this parable that Jesus is the one who sowed the good seed, and the devil is the one who sowed the tares. Well, let's go ahead and read and find out what his servants thought about all of this. So this is in verses 26 and 27 of Matthew 13. "But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?'" Well, I just thought that was really interesting because the servants are puzzled about what has happened. Because it was certainly not the intention of their master who owned the field to have that happen. So what in the world had happened? Now remember again that Jesus represents the man. He's the one who sowed the good seed. And also we know that the field belonged to him. That was a large field and it belonged to him. Plus, we know that he desired, this was his desire, that he could have a really good crop. And I think that's an interesting thing. But now we know that this field is mixed with tares, or it's mixed with weeds, and they you might say they're false grain. They're grain that looks like the wheat, but it has poison in it. And the servants, they just said, "What's happened here?" Well, the man is going to explain what happened in verses 28 and 29 of Matthew 13. He said to them, "An enemy has done this." The servants said to him, "Do you want us then to go and gather them up?" But he said, "No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them." Now, I thought that was really wise about what the man had said, the landowner. Now, the servants, they were ready to go out there and start picking up, but the man says, "No, don't do that, because something bad might happen." And it made me think of this. You know, churches, people sometimes get the idea that churches are places where, really good people and perfect people are, and that's not really true. Churches are made up of people who understood that they were lost and they were sinful and they needed someone to save them. And they found Jesus to be their Savior. And they love Jesus for what He done. And so they want to come to church, gather together, and serve and worship Him. But the thing about this, and you probably know this, that sometimes I suppose I don't know if in all churches, but there are people in churches that are not wheat, but they're also tares. And so it's a good lesson for churches here that you don't want to go. And churches have made this mistake. Maybe they've gone and tried to get rid of the tares. And what happened? Sure enough, some of the wheat was uprooted. That is to say, some of the people that shouldn't have been rooted got uprooted. And so you can see the problems that sometimes churches have. But I just think this is interesting. So Jesus explained that the enemy did it, and the enemy is the devil. And they wanted to come and pull that up, but the man said, "No, we're not going to do that, because you may also pull up the wheat." Well, let's look at the last verse. That's verse 30 in Matthew 13. So he said, here's what he said to him. He said, "Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn." Now, as I said, maybe mentioned this a little bit earlier about we couldn't cover all of the verses, but at the end of this chapter, or toward the end of it, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, "Explain this parable to us." And Jesus did. And you can read that. That's in verses 37 through 43, and I would encourage you to read it. But let me just kind of give a little summary about this. The earth itself will be harvested. The earth is actually the field, according to Jesus. And one day, the earth will be harvested. And that is to say, both the wheat and the tares will happen. Now, we know that the wheat, it represents God's people. Now, who are God's people? God's children are those who confess their sins, they repented of their sins, and they trusted in Jesus to be their Savior. Now, who are the tares? The tares are those who represent those who said, "No, we reject God. We reject His gracious offer of salvation." So, at the end of the age, what's going to happen? Well, the earth will be harvested by the reapers. Now, who are the reapers? Jesus explains who the reapers are. They're His angels. The angels will come. What will they do? The first thing they do, they will come and gather up the tares. And what will they do with the tares? They'll cast them into a furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It sounds like hell to me. What will happen to the wheat? The wheat will be gathered up, it'll be all collected by the angels, and it'll be taken into the barn. Now, what's the barn? The barn's heaven. And listen, we all want to end up in the barn, right? Well, listen, this is a great parable, I think. And I hope that you'll read it and look it over, the parable of the tares. We appreciate you joining us today and following us along in this parable, and we hope that you'll join us next time. Plus, we hope you have a really good week.